I'm Franklin. Some monsters hide in the woods. To understand the nightmare that descended upon Santa Cruz in the early 1970s, you first have to understand the sheer physical reality of Edmund Kemper III. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds. Yet, despite his imposing size, he was known as a gentle giant. He was soft-spoken, articulate, and possessed an IQ of 145. He was the kind of man who would help you change a flat tire on a lonely highway, smiling politely while he loosened the lug nuts. But behind those thick glasses and the shy demeanor lived a mind that had been broken and reassembled into something profoundly dangerous by years of psychological torment at the hands of his mother, Clarnell Strandberg. She was a woman of venomous words who constantly belittled him, locked him in the basement, and told him no woman would ever love a monster like him. Sadly, she was creating the very monster she feared. The first cracks in the dam appeared early, but the world truly saw what Ed was capable of on August 27, 1964. He was only 15 years old. He had run away to live with his paternal grandparents in the remote hills of North Fork, California. He hated his grandmother, Maud, a woman who mirrored his mother's oppressive nature. One afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table, the intrusive thought that had been buzzing in his head finally landed. He picked up a hunting rifle and shot Maud in the head. When his grandfather returned home from the grocery store, Ed shot him too, simply so the old man wouldn't have to see what had happened to his wife. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a science experiment. When he called his mother to confess, and later the police, his explanation was chillingly simple. I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma. The system did what it was designed to do. It removed him from society. Ed was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. For most, this would be the end of the story. For Kemper, it was university. Surrounded by rapists, murderers, and pedophiles, the young genius didn't cower. He studied. He realized quickly that the doctors held the keys to his freedom, and the keys were made of words. He learned exactly what the psychiatrists wanted to hear. He became a model patient, helpful and introspective. He even helped administer psychological tests to other patients, memorizing the correct answers that proved sanity. He learned the machinery of the human mind from the inside out, analyzing his own pathology with the detachment of a surgeon. By 1969, the doctors were convinced. They saw a rehabilitated young man who had overcome a tragic juvenile mistake. They believed his high intelligence was an asset to his recovery. In a decision that now seems like madness, they released him on his 21st birthday. His juvenile record was sealed permanently. The psychiatrists patted themselves on the back for a job well done. They sent this 6'9" killer back into the world, supposedly cured. And in a twist of fate that resembles a Greek tragedy, they released him into the custody of the one person on earth who triggered his murderous rage: his mother. Clarnell was waiting for him in Santa Cruz. She hadn't changed. The insults, the belittling, the psychological castration. It all started again immediately. But this time, Ed wasn't a 15-year-old boy with a rifle. He was a grown man, a student of psychiatry, and a ticking time bomb who had learned patience in the asylum. He got a job, bought a car, and started picking up hitchhikers just to see if he could. The experiment was about to enter its second, far darker phase. By 1972, the coastal town of Santa Cruz had earned a reputation as the hitchhiking capital of California, a sun-drenched paradise where university students, driven by the carefree spirit of the era, thumbed rides up and down the Pacific Coast Highway without a second thought. Into this trusting ecosystem drove Edmund Kemper in his massive 1969 Ford Galaxie 500, a vehicle that he had quietly transformed into a mobile prison. Using his mechanical aptitude, Kemper had modified the interior door locks so that they could not be opened from the inside, trapping his passengers the moment the doors clicked shut. He didn't start killing immediately. Like a scientist calibrating his instruments, he spent months picking up young women, driving them to their destinations unharmed, and engaging them in polite conversation, testing his ability to control his rising adrenaline, and refining the mask of the gentle giant that would become his ultimate camouflage. The experiment turned lethal in May 1972, when he picked up two Fresno State students, Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. He drove them to a secluded wooded area near Alameda, where the mask finally slipped. In a terrifying explosion of violence that contrasted sharply with his slow, plodding demeanor, he stabbed and strangled them, later dissecting their bodies in his apartment while his mother slept just a few rooms away. This marked the beginning of a gruesome ritual. Kemper would hunt the very type of women his mother claimed he could never have: young, beautiful, educated co-eds, and bring their remains back to her house as perverse trophies. He would often hide severed heads in his closet or bury them in the garden beneath his mother's window, positioning them to look up at her, a silent, grotesque act of defiance that no psychiatrist in the world could have predicted. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Kemper's reign of terror was not the murders themselves, but his social life. Ed Kemper was a cop groupie. He frequented a local bar called the Jury Room, a watering hole popular with off-duty police officers and sheriff's deputies. Because of his immense size and intelligent, respectful manner, the cops loved him. They nicknamed him Big Ed, bought him beers, and even gave him an official police sticker for his car bumper, a talisman that rendered him virtually invisible to patrol units. While the police were frantically searching for the co-ed killer, the man they were hunting was sitting right next to them on a bar stool, listening to their theories, asking detailed questions about the investigation, and internally laughing at their incompetence. He later admitted that he sometimes had the evidence of his crimes, a gun, a knife, or even human remains, locked in the trunk of his car parked just outside the bar, while he debated law enforcement tactics with the very men sworn to catch him. The psychological game reached its zenith in early 1973 with the murder of Cindy Shaw. After shooting her, Kemper transported her body in the trunk of his car, but he made a mistake. The body was heavy, and the trunk lid wasn't fully secure. As he drove through the city, he was terrified that a bump in the road would pop the trunk open, revealing the corpse to the motorists behind him. But his Big Ed persona saved him again. When he finally disposed of her remains, throwing them into the ocean, he kept her head. He brought it back to his mother's house and buried it in the front yard, squarely facing Clarnell's bedroom window. He later told psychiatrists that he wanted his mother to always be the center of attention. The tension of living this double life, the dutiful son and friend to the police by day, the butcher by night, was beginning to fray his nerves. But it wasn't fear of capture that stopped him. It was the realization that killing the surrogates wasn't enough. The co-eds were just stand-ins. The rage was directed at one specific target, and the time for the final confrontation was drawing near. By the spring of 1973, the tension inside the small house in Santa Cruz had reached a critical mass. Ed Kemper, the 6'9" genius, felt as though his skull were a pressure cooker about to explode. He had liquidated 6 young women, treating their bodies like biological puzzles, But the peace he sought after each murder was becoming increasingly fragile and short-lived. He realized, with the cold clarity of his 145 IQ, that the co-eds were merely placeholders. They were proxies for the one woman who had occupied his nightmares since childhood. His mother, Clarnell Strandberg. He had tried to silence her voice by killing strangers, but even as he sat in the living room, he could hear her sharp, belittling tone through the walls, criticizing his posture, his lack of ambition, and his very existence. On the night before Easter Sunday, April 20th, the experiment reached its inevitable, terminal conclusion. Kemper sat in the shadows of the hallway, waiting for the house to go silent. He watched his mother go to bed, her last words to him likely another stinging insult. He waited for hours, listening to the rhythm of her breathing until he was certain she was in a deep sleep. He entered her room carrying a claw hammer, the same tool he had used to build fences and repair things around the house. In a singular, explosive burst of violence, he struck her while she slept. It was the moment his entire life had been leading toward. But for Kemper, death was never enough. He needed to humiliate the source of his pain. He decapitated her and, in a gesture that haunts forensic psychologists to this day, he took her larynx, the very organ that had produced the voice that tormented him, and put it down the garbage disposal. But the disposal jammed, as if even the machine rejected her. He then used her head as a target for darts before placing it on a mantelpiece so she could finally watch him. The rage, however, was a contagious fire. He knew he couldn't stop there. He called his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, and invited her over for dinner under the guise of a surprise party for Clarnell. Sally, a kind woman who had no reason to fear Big Ed, arrived with a smile. Kemper strangled her almost immediately upon her entry. He later explained that he didn't hate Sally, but he couldn't leave her alive to find the mess he had made. He spent the rest of the night cleaning the house with a surreal robotic efficiency, packing a suitcase as if he were going on a mundane business trip. He threw the keys to his car on the table, took several $100s, and began driving east. He drove through the night, crossing state lines into Nevada and then Colorado, the vastness of the American highway stretching out before him like a blank slate. He thought he would feel free. He thought the silence would finally be absolute. But as the miles ticked by, he realized that the voice was no longer in the house in Santa Cruz. It was inside his own head, and there was no way to outrun it. The psychological collapse occurred in a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. Kemper, the man who had outsmarted the best psychiatrists in California and outdrank the toughest cops in Santa Cruz, simply gave up. He called the Santa Cruz Police Department, but the irony of his friendly giant persona struck one last time. The officer on the other end of the line thought it was a prank. He knew Ed. Everyone knew Ed. He was the guy who bought the cops beer. "Stop joking around, Big Ed," the officer said. Kemper had to insist, providing details of the crime scenes that hadn't been released to the press, describing the exact position of the bodies and the items he had taken from the victims. Only then did the silence on the other end of the line become heavy with the realization that the monster they had been hunting had been sitting next to them all along. Kemper waited patiently for the local police to arrive, standing by the phone booth, his massive frame a silhouette against the Colorado sky, surrendered not by force, but by the sheer exhaustion of being Edmund Kemper. When Ed Kemper was brought back to California, the trial was less a legal proceeding and more a public autopsy of a broken mind. He refused to plead insanity. His ego, as massive as his body, wouldn't allow him to be seen as mad. He wanted the world to know exactly how calculated, how precise, and how superior he had been. He requested the death penalty, even suggesting death by torture as a fitting end for his crimes. However, California had recently suspended the death penalty, and Kemper was sentenced to 8 concurrent life terms in the California Medical Facility at Vacaville. This was not the end of his story, but the beginning of his second act as the most influential consultant in the history of criminal profiling. In the late 1970s, 2 young FBI agents, John Douglas and Robert Ressler, were trying to build a new science, behavioral profiling. They wanted to understand why serial killers did what they did, but they needed a teacher. They found him in Vacaville. Kemper, bored with prison life and eager for intellectual stimulation, welcomed the agents. He spent hundreds of hours in a small, cramped interview room, towers of transcripts and tapes recording his voice as he broke down his own pathology. He spoke with the detachment of a professor lecturing a class, explaining the tension release cycle, the fantasy life of a predator, and the specific triggers that led him to choose his victims. He was the one who helped the FBI coin the term serial killer, moving away from the outdated stranger killer label. Kemper's contributions were not merely academic. He helped the FBI catch others. When the agents were stumped by a new case, they would bring the details to Ed. He would look at the photos of the crime scene, analyze the signature of the killer, and tell the agents exactly what kind of man they were looking for. He predicted the behavior of killers like Ted Bundy and helped refine the techniques that would eventually be used to track down the Green River Killer and others. He became a star in the world of criminology, a living library of darkness. To the agents, he was a gold mine. To the other inmates, he was a giant who could kill a man with his bare hands, but chose to spend his time reading books. In fact, Kemper spent years narrating thousands of hours of audiobooks for the blind. His calm, deep, and articulate voice, reading everything from Star Wars novels to classic literature. A final, bizarre irony for a man who had used his voice to lure women to their deaths. Today, Edmund Kemper remains in prison, one of the oldest and longest-serving inmates in the California system. He has consistently waived his right to parole hearings, stating plainly that he is not fit to return to society and that he would likely kill again if released. He lives in a world of routine and memory, a man who successfully committed the ultimate experiment and lived to explain the results. He remains the gold standard for the organized serial killer, a man of high intelligence, perfect social camouflage, and a total lack of empathy. His story serves as a haunting reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who growl in the dark, but the ones who smile at you in the light, offer you a ride, and speak with the calm, reasoned voice of a friend. The friendly giant proved that while you can lock a man in a cage, the darkness he mapped out remains a permanent part of the human landscape, a territory he explored so thoroughly that we are still using his maps to this day.